Therapy. That's the name of today's Instagram Live, where I'll be speaking to a marriage and family therapist, Usman Mughni, who's based in the United States. I'll be speaking to him about sex addiction and some of the challenges that he's faced dealing with both sex and porn addiction, particularly amongst religious communities and Muslims in particular. The topic of today's discussion is sex addiction, where I'll be speaking to a Muslim family therapist, a Muslim marriage and family therapist. Usman Mughni is also the founder of Peace for You organization, which is a private practice, I understand, which helps people who are struggling with various mental health issues as well as addictions such as porn addiction. Hopefully Usman is on the live. He was having some technical difficulties before. I want to send him an invite again, just for the benefit of people joining. Therapist based in the United States of America. He also has a private practice. Oh, I think he's joined. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah, Habeeb. How's it going?
MashaAllah.
How are you able to see me and hear me? I apologize. I was trying to set it up on my laptop, so I guess it didn't work on the laptop. But you're able to hear me and see me just clearly?
Yeah, no worries. I can see you and hear you perfectly. It's nice to see you after so long, brother. How are you?
Good. Do you know how long it's been since I'm seeing you, man? It's 16 years.
How many years?
16. 1-6.
No way.
16 years, bro. 2007. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay. Subhanallah. Yeah, time flies. I mean,
time flies.
Just for the benefit of people listening in. So we met it was in Egypt. So when I was studying in Egypt, I think is Ahmed your family friend or from Chicago?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Amr and I are very close. Yes.
So one of my roommates, who is now, mashallah, a scholar in residence, and he's also a podcast of the Mad Mamluks, Ahmed Saeed. So he's a friend of Usman, and Usman and his brother, I believe, came to visit Egypt when I was studying in 2007 or 2006.
Yeah, that's 2007.
Yeah,
right.
I think it was there for a few. How long was you in Egypt for?
About 6 months. I actually remember you sat down, you took out time from your schedule and taught my brother and I Ajrumiyya. You went through that with us. So.
Really?
Wow. Yeah.
You know, it's strange because Maheen recently messaged me and he did say that you reached out, and I was like, I couldn't remember you at the time because he said that you reached out to me on Facebook. So I went back to Facebook and you messaged me in 2014.
Yeah.
And you mentioned like, oh, do you remember me from 7 years ago? And at the time, I'll be honest, I didn't really remember you. And then after, I actually watched a couple of your interviews. So I did recognize you while watching the interviews. But when you messaged me on Facebook, I was like, no, I don't really remember. So I do apologize. And I actually thought I responded
No, it's
back
okay. It's all good.
16 years. Yeah, that's a long time.
I don't know if you remember Brother Abdul Kabir? He's also from the UK.
Abdul
Kabir.
Abdul Kabir Karim.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, because obviously, of course, I remember him.
He's my neighbor now, man.
No way.
No way. He's out in Dallas. Yeah.
No way. No, he messaged me from time to time on Facebook. So please pass my salam. I've not spoken to or heard from him actually for a number of years. But yeah, it's a small world, but alhamdulillah, it's good to see obviously the great work that you're doing. And again, that's why I wanted to obviously speak to you, have this conversation so people can hear about the work that you're doing both within the Muslim community and non-Muslim communities. But before we get into that, can you give a quick elevator pitch preamble just in terms of who you are and the work that you do?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I was working in a few different hospitals prior to going to private practice. So now I have a private practice out in Dallas, Texas, where I see people in person, but I also see people across the U.S. and across the world through a virtual therapy. And I deal with a host of different things. So I do specialize in like pornography addiction. I work a lot with like anxiety, depression. I do a lot of premarital counseling, marriage counseling, things like that.
MashaAllah. I do apologize. I am listening. I'm just trying to tag you in your comments so people can obviously find a bit about yourself. And sorry, so how did you get into to become a therapist? What's your journey
Oh,
to
no,
becoming?
yeah, that's a great question because when you met me, the goal was to get into Jamiat al-Azhar, right? So I was hoping to study Islam at a formal level. And I mean, it just so happens, you have plans, and I think God has other plans for you, and everything seems to kind of come together. So at that time, I was actually a radiology tech, so I was operating X-ray machines and so on. And then when I had to come back to the U.S., help my dad out with a few things, so we weren't able to continue our studies in Egypt. But when I came back, I worked for a little bit in a few clinics, and then I ended up becoming a Quran teacher. And so I was out in Maryland teaching Quran, and one of my mentors over there, he was telling me about he was the imam of the community. He was telling me about the the dire need for Muslims to go into the mental health professional because at that time, this is about 2010, 2011 we're talking about. At that time, there was a huge shortage of Muslim mental health professionals who were able to understand some of the cultural nuances that our communities face, right? Because there are specific if you go to a therapist who maybe doesn't understand your culture, doesn't understand your background, your framework, you spend most of the session trying to explain to them why you view things a certain way, and then their whole perspective, their advice, their view is going to be through maybe a Eurocentric lens, maybe through something that uh, you can't connect with, and so much of therapy and therapy being effective is you being able to connect with your therapist and feel that my therapist actually understands me, understands my pain points, he understands my background and where I'm coming from. So that kind of inspired me a few different situations. We had a young kid who lost his father at a young age, and we as a school didn't know how to properly support him, and so I really started to see the lack of resources, and I really want to try and do something more than just try and comfort somebody by beneficial advice, but do it in a research-based, proper way. You know.
MashaAllah. So was that in 2010 you started to when? How long did it take for you to become qualified?
So no, that's a great question. So in the U.S., it's you have to do your undergrad, right? So that's about 4 years, and then grad school is ranging anywhere from like 2 to 3 years. Alhamdulillah, I was blessed in that. Like my grad school is 2.5 years, but it was a amazing program. Very clinic heavy. I got paid to go to school, so that was the best part of it. Alhamdulillah, because I don't know if in the UK they have free education, but in the US they do not. It's very expensive, and after that, you have to complete 3,000 hours of face-to-face client contact. So that takes between 2 to 5 years. So once you complete that, then you sit for your licensure, and then you get to practice.
MashaAllah. MashaAllah. It's interesting you spoke about, like you said, you had plans and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God Almighty has other plans for you. And obviously, only God knows best, but the work that you're doing now is probably more beneficial and productive for society, not only for people but yourself, than if you were to maybe have done formal Islamic education and kind of become an imam. And I'm not saying that to denigrate the role of an imam or a religious teacher or anything like that. The only reason I'm saying that is because from the people that I've spoke to, like who did like formal Islamic studies at like at a higher level at a university or what have you, a number of them when they come back and they serve as like religious or community leaders or imams or what have you, most of what they've studied, they're not going to use it in reality.
Of course.
A lot of it's theoretical. That's not to say that the knowledge is not beneficial, but a lot of the work, especially for community leaders, imams in particular, that I've spoken to, that they say that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, is pastoral care. It's to do with relationships. And a lot of that is not really given in the formal studies that they've received. If anything, they might learn some scholarly opinions from the medieval period, which is not really practical now. So then they also have that struggle where, okay, they're in this position of authority, this position of leadership, but then they are not qualified or not competent enough to deal with the different landscape that they're involved, that they have to deal with. And this is practical, real life things that people will be coming to them on a daily basis about these things. And it's something that I've noticed, even like I said, speaking to a number of people who have come back after spending a number of years abroad, is that it's quite difficult even when you go into the community and dealing with all of these issues. A lot of them are really unprepared for it, not only from they haven't had the necessary training, but they're in a different culture as well. So even though they've been born and bred in the UK or the US, spending like 5 to 10 years abroad, when you're in somewhat of a bubble, even if you're in like Egypt or Saudi or Yemen or what have you, then going into the US and then dealing with, it's a total different world. And that's something that it's good that there's people like yourself who are
Thank you.
well versed and trained in the Islamic sciences, but also have the professional training and the research behind to kind of offer those services to the community leaders and the religious figures and what have you, because that is like a lot of the questions that when I speak to like religious leaders and things they always kind of talk about, it's always like marriage issues or relationship issues or and porn addiction and sex addiction, but they're struggling in terms of how to deal with it. So it's good that, like you said, that you know, like that the work that you're doing, and also speaking from a perspective that you can also inform maybe people who are not familiar with the Muslim understanding of Islamic. So like therapists who maybe might be obviously not of the Islamic faith, and they've got Muslim clients, so they can understand again where they're coming from and maybe some of their cultural and values. So yeah, your work is definitely, you know, much needed. So just wanted to say that. But the topic of sex addiction, the reason I wanted to kind of really, or porn addiction, kind of focus on that, because I wanted to make the conversation a bit more focused. And the reason why I'm saying that is because that is probably, I didn't realize how much of an issue it was until I kind of really started to do some of the work that I'm doing, speaking about the history of Muslims, speaking about sex and erotomology and things like that. Amongst men, I often hear that like a lot of men are struggling with like porn addiction, and obviously their wives or female partners or mothers, what have you, always kind of having those issues with their children. Is it something that you've seen, like in your experience, like sex or porn addiction? Is it like a common issue or challenge that you face with clients?
No, it's extremely common. I mean, just over the years, how accessible it's become. I mean, you know, some of these websites will get, I mean, views within the billions, right? And so it is definitely something. I mean, not to sound like an alarmist, but just over time with the, you know, the advancement of technology, accessibility, it's becoming more and more of an issue. And so, I mean, even the average age of exposure to pornography and pornographic content is getting younger and younger. So I think the last statistics showed around like age like 9 or 10, you know. And I mean, I have a 9-year-old myself, and so I think about that often, like when he's on the laptop playing Roblox and so on. It's, you know, it's something so prevalent and pervasive in our society. And I think we, even in our field, because you know, the pornography has been around for a few years, but it's becoming more and more now. And like there's virtual reality, there's AI, there's all of these things that are going to change the playing field more. We still are working on like a formal diagnosis. So believe it or not, there's not an actual in the DSM, or the Diagnostic Manual of diagnosing, there's not a specific diagnosis for pornography addiction. So this has been kind of just like there's not a specific diagnosis for sex addiction. So this has kind of been an issue of debate right now. Personally, I think it should be added on. So most people, when you say yes, you have a pornography addiction, it's not necessarily a formal diagnosis. It would fall more under kind of what we call like an impulse control or a behavioral addiction. And sometimes it's known as a process addiction as well. And the reason we call it that is because it follows a very similar process from a biological perspective. It follows a very similar process to a drug addiction. You know, so you have the same brain pathways are working when you see certain images, and then you start to see more, and you watch videos, and typically the pattern is that the video is becoming more and more explicit, and then you know fall into this pattern of, you know, watching, masturbating, ejaculating, and then repeating the cycle over and over again. Your brain gets wired just as someone with any type of drug addiction. So we call it a process or a behavioral addiction.
I'm actually glad. Thank you actually for defining and explaining that, because actually we should have led for that from the beginning. To be fair, in terms of there's a debate amongst people in your field, professionals, in terms of whether sex addiction is an actual like mental disorder, if it's actually an actual real diagnosis, or whether it's like I said, a behavioral problem. So are you on the side of the camp that you believe that it is a mental disorder, or do you believe it's a behavioral?
I do believe it is. I do believe it is. I mean, even if we were to drop the label, what we look at is how does it interfere with your day-to-day functioning, right? And I also want to delineate between, there's a difference between sex addiction and pornography addiction. When we talk about sex addiction, so this is a term that was coined by Dr. Patrick Carnes, I believe is how you pronounce it,
Yeah.
Carnes. If you ever look up his his groundbreaking book was called Out of the Shadows, and so he's
Yeah.
the first psychologist to talk about the idea of sex addiction. Now that's talking about the actual physical act, and that falls into like repeated infidelity and so on. Whereas with pornography addiction, uh, and this is important, I think, for especially couples where if your spouse is struggling with it. Somebody who's addicted to pornography is not necessarily fantasizing or has plans to cheat on their spouse. Whereas with sex addiction, it's a little different. It is actually getting a high or thrill off of pursuing other women. And I've even worked with people who won't go through with the act, but just the idea of like getting a girl to meet you at a hotel, they won't fall all the way through. But even that and the dopamine rush that you get with that becomes an addiction. So it's kind of different.
Isn't porn addiction like a subset of sex addiction? So like sex addiction, and I've read Patrick Carney's book, and he was talking about,
Oh,
I
you
think he
did,
mentioned it's like a
yeah.
brain disease, and he mentioned that it's like basically a type of behavior that's somewhat out of control, and that could be excessive watching of pornography, which would be considered to be porn addiction. It could be visiting
Sure.
strip clubs. It could be excessive like womanizing. It could be engaging in hookup culture that is somewhat
Sure.
detrimental to the
Yeah, yeah,
person.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
so wouldn't porn addiction then be part a sex addiction? Not every porn addict is a sex addict, but not every sex addict is a porn
Yeah,
addict.
exactly. Yeah. Right, right. Correct. Correct. The reason I make that clarification, Habib, is because I get this question asked a lot, and it's subjective. Like, is it cheating? And I'm sure you've spoken to couples, so they ask like, okay, my husband or my wife is addicted to pornography. Is this considered infidelity or not? You know,
I
where
mean,
where where? Yeah, yeah.
no, that's a good one, but that's a subjective.
Yes.
I mean, because
Mhm.
that's like someone saying my missus is, or the missus is accusing the husband of liking a woman's picture on Instagram. She might consider that to be cheating.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
But is that
Correct.
actually infidelity? Again, it depends on how one defines it. Because
Exactly.
because I was listening to someone, they were talking about like the difference between cheating and adultery. It was actually a Christian podcast, I believe, and they were saying how every like adultery is obviously extramarital relationship. So if you're having sex outside of marriage and you're married, that's adultery. But if you're in an open relationship and again, I'm just speaking hypothetically, you consent for your partner,
Right.
your spouse to have sex outside of marriage, that is adultery, but it's not cheating because the partner knows. So she was kind of clarifying
Interesting.
the difference because so
Interesting.
the
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
we use terms again, it's important that one obviously. I mean, there's terms that's clearly defined, like adultery, obviously sex outside of marriage, whether marriage, so that's
Right.
again
Right.
clearly defined. But when we have terms like cheating, maybe even somewhat infidelity, that may differ depending on the couple themselves and the culture as well. So it's
Sure.
important that we're all speaking on like you understand where the person's coming
No,
from.
no,
So I
no.
think it has to be
100%. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And absolutely. And from an Islamic paradigm, right? Like, I mean, we have the idea of like infidelity of the eyes or zina of the eyes,
exactly.
And
Yeah.
so and it is a fair point. Like I definitely empathize with women who will say that no, I equate it to cheating. In that, you know, if you are a practicing Muslim woman and you're covering up for your spouse and you're making all your efforts to be modest and be mindful of the way you interact with the opposite gender, and your spouse is watching anything and everything, right? So you're going to feel a certain way about it, right?
Yeah.
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 It's a difficult one. Again, I just think I listened to I think interview you had with the Mad Mumlux, and you said something along the lines of you was talking about some of the experiences you've had with clients, and I think you were speaking about someone who mentioned that porn is worse than zina. No, zina, yeah,
Yeah.
porn is worse than zina. Like premarital, extramarital sex.
Right.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're arguing the point that from your experience, it could be the opposite, that actually maybe, obviously zina is worse than porn, but I mean, can you
Correct.
expand on that? Because I was quite interested, I think, when you was getting to that, because I think one of the things that I've noticed is that with people who are against porn and people speaking against it, sometimes I've noticed there's some somewhat exaggerated claims made about porn, as
Yes.
if everyone who
Yes.
watches porn
Exactly.
is going to be
Exactly.
addicted. And I think they're coming from maybe like a good place in the sense of trying to prevent people from maybe indulging. But then when
Right.
someone is speaking some mistruths, I think then you lose the credibility. The credibility of the
You
speaker will
lose
be lost. So if someone
credibility.
wants to say,
Exactly.
yeah, so if someone wants to say something like claims like, okay, if you watch porn, you're going to become addicted to it. I think that type of rhetoric can work if you're speaking to 12 to maybe 8 to 13-year-olds. But then once someone gets to a certain age, and for example, someone could have been watching porn for 10, 15 years and they're still able to have a healthy sex life. Again, I'm not saying Islamically it's okay, but I'm just saying when
Right.
people making
Sure.
like claims that, if you watch porn, you're automatically going to suffer from erectile dysfunction, you won't be able to perform in bed, you're going to be addicted to it.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, so that's something that I'm just thinking, okay, how can we get to a point where, okay, you're speaking facts, and you're speaking again from evidence, but at the same time, you're not making these wild and exaggerated claims in order to kind of maybe prevent people from like a harm that you perceive, obviously.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. 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 And people will ask me this, right? Like, oh, is it going to lead to erectile dysfunction and so on? And we don't have any solid evidence of that. And so, I mean, I appreciate that you say that, because you're right. You lose credibility when you start to make these claims, right? This is similar. In the U.S., there's this whole issue about cannabis, for example, right? And for the longest time, cannabis was deemed like the worst thing. And I'm not promoting cannabis whatsoever, but I am
Yeah,
promoting honesty, and not all drugs are created equal. So I used to work with a lot of people struggling with drug addiction, so I would never say that heroin or even alcohol is the same as cannabis, right? So are there adults who are of like sound mind and don't have necessarily addictive personality who can use cannabis occasionally without it causing severe ramifications? Yeah, maybe. You know, we're still we don't have any like huge longitudinal studies right now about the effects of it, but yeah, I'm not a fan of like scare tactics. So here's what I can say is that overuse of pornography, um, from a psychological perspective, it can impact how you view things like foreplay, for example. It can impact how you view intimacy. So typically, when somebody's watching pornography, they're not they're not watching like the foreplay in the beginning. They're fast forward to whatever scenes that they want, correct? And that's not how intimacy works. And obviously, you've written extensively about what the whole idea of intimacy, and the importance of even from a woman's perspective, and like, so that kind of gets all thrown out the window when your entire perspective is like, really it's manufactured intimacy. That's what pornography is. It's complete hogwash, right? But psychologically, if you start to think that this is how intimacy is and then play on that, that can definitely impact
yeah.
you.
I loved what you said about the your for honesty as opposed to like the scare tactics.
Yeah.
So and I'm assuming that maybe, I don't know if that's your own personality, your own character, because of your training. Because I've noticed that if I'm speaking or listening to people coming from more of a, like you can say, religious angle, be more of a or activist angles, like the scare tactics, or if they're
Yeah.
speaking to like children. Whereas if you're speaking to someone who's like a professional, who's a clinician, it's more of actually based on research. It's not
Right.
making these like wild generalizations. So that being the case,
Correct.
obviously with
Correct.
your experience, how do you find working with, because I know you've done a lot of work with like religious speakers and leaders and scholars in the US in particular. How do you find working with them in terms of dealing with this issue, in terms of like giving them that information, how they're going to convey that?
Are you specifically about pornography, or you're talking about?
Pornography. So for example, so for example, someone might say from a religious perspective, don't want, and you might hear it in a khutbah in a mosque. If you watch pornography, it's going to lead to erectile dysfunction, and all of that claims that is not
Yeah.
100% true, that it might lead to it. So is that something part of your work? Do you also like work with religious leaders and scholars to kind of help clarify these points. And the reason why I'm saying that is because if I'm hearing
yeah,
mistruths, and the point you mentioned about cannabis, it hit home for me because when I was younger, I used to hear,
yeah,
people used to say, if you smoke
yeah.
cannabis, you're gonna. I just think it's dangerous if you've got someone who is of a religious authority saying something that
Yeah, yeah. Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah. No, so that
supported by science and valid
sure,
research.
sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. No, that's no. Absolutely. No, that's a good point. I mean, and to be completely honest, I'll call myself out on it. I haven't done a good enough job with regards to education about specifically pornography addiction. I've worked a lot with different imams speaking about misconceptions about like depression, about anxiety, about OCD, other mental health struggles. But specifically about pornography, no, I have a lot more work to do. So yeah.
Okay, so given that it's an issue, pornography addiction in particular in Muslim communities, why do you think? Again, I'm just trying to find like why is it that maybe Muslim scholars haven't maybe reached out more to people like yourself for help in that regard?
I mean, I think it works both ways, right? So, in Dallas, I will say that the Muslim community here is slightly more progressive than I've seen in other communities, and I'm not sure how it is in the UK, but we are starting to see a trend more and more towards acceptance of mental health professionals in the mental health field and reconnecting it. Sorry, I'll go on a tangent, but reconnecting it with the Islamic tradition, right? Because we were the first people. I'm sure you've read this as well, right? Who had psychiatric hospitals in Baghdad, right? The first book on cognitive behavioral therapy ever written was written by a Muslim, Abu Zaid al-Balkhi, right? So
Okay.
this is something that was yes, correct, yeah, was linked to our history. So now we're starting to make that connection again and kind of reclaim um, that part of our history. So I am seeing a change. I think with pornography, we're not there yet. Like I said, there's still some work to do with educating people. I will say this as well. Look, I work with Muslims and non-Muslims, and I've had non-Muslims who wouldn't even consider themselves devout Christians who've come to me and said, "Look, this is not a matter of me thinking that God is going to, smite me down or anything like that. I don't believe I'm sinful for watching pornography. In fact, my fiance and I, or my girlfriend and I, or my wife and I are okay with watching pornography. Sometimes we watch pornography together. However, I've noticed that I'm spending a little bit more time on it than I want to, and I've noticed that like it's taking more control of my day than I want to. So not even from a moral perspective, not even from a religious perspective, just from a purely functional, I want to optimize my time and I don't want something else to have that much control over me. Help me get rid of this.
Mm, mm. Now, I think the point you mentioned as well, especially about reclaiming our tradition, and you mentioned is Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, who was known as like one of the first people to set up like a psychiatric hospital in the 9th century in Baghdad. And I've noticed now there are a number of Muslims, particularly in the Western world, who are reclaiming that heritage of like Islamic psychology and saying that we was amongst the first people to kind of speak about these mental health issues and conditions, but sexual sciences. That was also part of. So I'm also trying to understand why is it that they
Mm,
were able to reclaim psychology, we're able to reclaim mental health, professionals to kind of impact help not only Muslims but non-Muslims, but
yeah,
from the same period, the 9th, 10th century, they also spoke about sexology
yeah.
and sexual sciences, which was the forerunner of modern sexology. So I'm just trying to understand why is there this disconnect where we're really uncomfortable to talk about
Yeah.
like sex and porn addiction or all of, again, whether you want to call it porn addiction or not, but people are struggling.
Yeah.
So in those days, they called it, what's that? Ishq, like
Yeah.
infatuation, or
Exactly.
some
Yeah.
people translate it as
Yeah.
hypersexuality. So he did have an
Right.
understanding that there are people who are struggling with either unwanted desire or a desire that they're struggling with. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alludes to it in the Quran with the story of the women when they were infatuated.
Yusuf. Yeah. Right.
best to kind of help people in the community. So, but yeah, I think that's definitely probably something that more work needs to be
Right,
done. But
right.
it's good that we've got people like yourself
Yeah.
who are trained and can assist. I had a couple of questions. So I just want to make sure I answer them because, like I
Sure,
said,
sure,
I
sure.
do want to make this a conversation, but there are some things I wanted to kind of actually specifically ask. Before asking some of the questions, can you again just quickly, for the benefit of people who have recently joined, quick overview in terms of who you are, the work that you do again, and where people can find your services? So I don't to kind of be able to reach out because
Sure,
one of
sure,
my
absolutely. So,
we haven't got people.
sure. Okay. Okay, no, thank you. So, my name is Usman Mughni. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I reside here in the U.S. So I work a lot with different types of addictions. I do work with anxiety, depression. I do a lot of couples counseling. So I could be reached. You can reach me through my Instagram, or you can reach me through my website. It's www.peaceful.org.
Lovely. Now back to the topic at hand. You have kind of touched on this, but I'll just ask anyway. Can whether you want to call the person a religious person or a practicing Muslim, can they be addicted to porn? Is it possible?
100%. 100%. And I see it a lot. I actually within the very practicing religious crowd, and there's this huge disconnect, this dichotomy that they face because they're like, look, I know this is forbidden in Islam, and why do I keep falling back into it? And we're trying to tell them that it's not necessarily only a matter of God consciousness. Well, God consciousness stuff will helps, right? There is we operate on what's known as a biopsychosocial spiritual model, right? So it's multifactorial. There is a biological component to it. Yes, there are people who are just more prone to get addicted to things in general, right? There are people who are just more prone to getting addicted to sweets, right? Genetically speaking. There's a social component to it. There's a psychological component to it as well. I sometimes will have people who use pornography as a means to de-stress, use pornography to deal with their anxiety, use pornography when they just feel angry or frustrated. And so the brain makes that connection that anytime I feel angry, frustrated, experience any type of negative emotion, this is what's going to soothe it, right? And so that connection gets stronger. So it's not just as simple as if you fear God, you are not going to fall into this. You know what I'm saying? Because even that rhetoric is very damaging because that would assume that anybody who falls into this doesn't fear God. And how does that help the person? They're like, okay, so great, I'm struggling with this, and I'm a bad Muslim, or I'm a bad Christian, or I'm just a bad person. So what's the point? And in fact, what concerns me more than the pornography addiction, itself, and just from just a spiritual perspective, is the person just giving up on themselves. That's more damaging to me. You know? Yeah.
Very, very well said. I think, yeah, and that's something that I wholeheartedly agree to. Despair from God's mercy is far worse than someone I indulge. Again, not making light of sex addiction, infidelity, and things like that, but for someone to
Right.
despair from the mercy of God, that's far worse. I think, yeah, it's important that we kind of debunk this idea that because someone is committed to their faith, whether they're Christian, Muslim, like you said, there's some people that are more prone to it than others. So if you have if for and I'm assuming that especially when it comes to porn addiction, it's more frequent in men as opposed to women. Would you agree?
Yes, that's what the numbers show. It is more frequent. Um, I will personally have more men approach me than women. I have had women tell me that they struggle with it, but I don't think that's necessarily a numbers issue. I think that's just more of comfort. Like sometimes when women struggle with this, they won't necessarily feel comfortable going to a male therapist, right? So within my own community and within the people I work with, I don't see it as much. Um, it's not completely imbalanced. It's not from the statistics that I read, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but like the latest statistics that I read, it's not like 99% men and 1% women. So women do struggle with it as well. Um, but yeah, like I mean, from what I've seen, it is more men than women. And then that this is something, and I'm sure that you face this a lot. This idea, and sorry to go on a tangent, of having sexual thoughts or being a little bit more having a higher libido in women is considered taboo or bad, right, culturally. I think that you've done a great job trying to combat that and show that that's something very natural. So I think that when we start to clarify that and say, no, that's the way God created you. There's nothing wrong with that. If you have a higher sex drive as a woman, then maybe we'll start to see more people come up and talk about more women come up and talk about some of the things that they're struggling with. So you're doing a lot of great work too. Barakallah feek.
Right, Jazakallah khairan. And what general advice, again, apart from coming to book a consultation with yourself, what general advice would you give to a woman, for example, who suspects that a husband is addicted to porn or visiting prostitutes or has a sex addiction problem? So what general advice would you give?
Yeah. So I mean, it's difficult. Obviously, you have to be true to yourself and true to your principles, right? So for some people, that's just a hard line of like, look, this is just not something that I can stand with and stand by. If the person is struggling, it's challenging, Habib, because if you're the person who's hurt and you're simultaneously trying to empathize with the other person, it's a very challenging dynamic. I will say that I've worked with some of the most sincere, honest, good-hearted people who are struggling with this. So it's not necessarily a reflection of your character. It's not necessarily a reflection of who you are as an individual. But it's about learning. So I'll just like if you yourself are struggling with it, it's about learning the steps in the pattern. You have to think several steps ahead when it comes to a behavioral addiction, or like kind of impulse control issues. You have to think like 20 steps ahead. So I'll give you an example. If somebody is saying that, look, I try my best, I pray, I fast, I do whatever I can to leave this sin, but I just keep, falling into it over and over again. What we'll do is we kind of break down step by step what happens from the time you think about, something to the time you actually, sit down in front of, in front of a screen and, masturbate and ejaculate. Let's break down the steps. And there might be a step there where they're like, well, I aimlessly browse on Instagram for like 20, 30 minutes. So then I tell them that is when you relapsed. So that's where we have to like cut it off. That's where you like start to build some awareness. Okay, now I'm, kind of on a slippery slope. So now let me take a step back. So it's about awareness of your personal triggers, your personal pattern. So that's from the person struggling. From the one who's on the other end, like I said, it's difficult because it is hurtful. It's tough for people to hear this, but if your spouse is struggling with pornography, they're not sitting there fantasizing about I want to marry this woman and have children with this woman on the other side of the screen. They understand it's completely manufactured. They understand that like this is not somebody that they would in real life want to be with, but it's just again that brain pattern. It's an impulse thing, so it's not necessarily that they're comparing you, right? So because I've seen women unfortunately go on another extreme where then they will just feel so bad about themselves that they'll like go on like these crash diets and say, okay, that means I don't look good and I have to like try and look like these women. And no, that's not it. You're fine in the way you look. It's not that your spouse is comparing you.
Yeah, well said. And do you do separate like counselling or therapy sessions? So, for example, if you've got a couple and, for example, the man is struggling with porn addiction, would your counselling services differ if you're speaking to men, the husband as opposed to the wife, or is it the same? Like, would you be delivering the same message to both of them at the same session, or is it like tailored differently? Where you do individual sessions?
No, that's a great question. I mean, the sessions will be tailored differently, right? Because it's on the individual's need. Like, so with the spouse who is affected, who's going through the porn addiction, right? It would be more of a behavioral approach of like, okay, this is step by step how we can break out of this, right? While also, being patient through their spouse's frustration, because you've now caused your spouse to have severe anxiety and trust issues and so on. And so how do we navigate through that? So there's a lot going on at once. And typically I'll see the couple and then I'll break them, apart and just have like some individual sessions. Then I might check in with the other spouse and see how they're doing and what they need to see in order to rebuild trust with their partner. So it's a multi-step process.
No, thank you for saying that. I'm glad you said what you said, because one of the things that I've noticed is that sometimes if a woman is on the receiving end, like her partner has this, porn habit or porn problem, sometimes the advice that she might receive is straight away like, there's no hope, divorce and get rid of him.
Yeah.
Unless they've
So you froze for a second.
So can you hear me now?
Yeah, okay. So say it again, yeah.
Yeah, so I was just saying that's what I've seen, and it's sometimes, for example, if a woman's partner's got a porn problem or a sex addiction problem, and maybe is having a relationship outside. For some women, again, that's it's a red flag, and instant divorce. Whereas others, they're able to overcome that with counselling and maybe forgiveness and things like that. Is that something that you've seen, that people who've been struggling, that have been able to overcome it and still have like healthy and fulfilling like marriages? Is that something
Yes.
that people have been able to?
No, absolutely. I have, and I would never advise somebody just immediately divorce, because we want to minimize the what ifs afterwards. Like, you divorce somebody because maybe you got that advice, or other people would say, well, I would never put up with something like that. But you're the one who has to live with the divorce afterwards. And if you have kids, you're the one who has to live with that. And so, we want to try and minimize saying that, well, what if I did this? What if I did that? What if I could have done something different, right? Now, in a situation where you've tried everything, you've done therapy, and the partner is still not changing, your spouse, your husband, still not changing, that's different, right? That's when I can be blunt sometimes and say, look, we've tried this, we've tried this, we've tried this. At a certain point, it might be damaging for you to continue, but definitely not right off the bat, And it varies case by case. This is another tangent. Habeeb, I don't know if you remember, I used to talk a lot back then. I still talk a lot now. So I don't like when people conflate generic advice with specific advice, right? Every advice that's given, whether it's from an imam, whether it's from a best friend, whether from a parent, it's through a specific lens. It's through, a lens of maybe like if they had a specific trauma, if they were cheated on, right? If you have a friend who was cheated on, her advice or his advice is going to be very different than somebody who maybe has a healthy marriage. And so you have to take every advice with a little bit of a grain of salt and look at your specific unique situation, right? There's no hard and fast rule. If your spouse watches pornography, you have to divorce. Or if your spouse watches pornography, no matter what, you have to stick it through. Each case is separate. Each case is an individual, and you have to look at the nuances within your situation.
No, I agree with that 100%. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah.
And I think that understanding that nuances as well, I think it's very important, because I think it's like, if, for example, someone, and the reason why I asked the question I asked is because, especially like on social media, I've noticed that there seems to be like people are quick to judge, especially if, for example, someone has, had an affair or struggling with sex or porn addiction, is get out, immediately divorce, get rid of him, this and the other. And it's like,
right,
you're not going to be the person who's going to have to deal with the consequence, and they might have been able to overcome that. And that's where sometimes people feel it's better not to kind of speak about their problems, because they're actually going to receive bad advice, because people are going to speak either from what maybe they would do, and it's easier to say what you would do, but if you're in that situation, it's totally different kind of thing. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, the difference between like general advice and, specific tailored advice.
And this is by no means condoning, a spouse stepping out of the marriage in any capacity, stepping out of the relationship in any capacity. But again, it's, yeah.
But again, when you're, because again, we're adults, we're speaking about adults, we're dealing with, well, I'm assuming we're dealing with adults, so people should understand or be able to appreciate nuance, and they should be able to appreciate, and that even sometimes when someone is giving advice, or like an imam is giving a fatwa or an opinion, that fatwa or that legal opinion might be for specific individual, specific situation, or might be a specific period. And that's something that I think sometimes Muslims don't really appreciate, or sometimes I think what happens with, to be fair to a lot of the imams or religious leaders, they're worried that for example, if they might give a piece of advice that for one specific individual, this might be the case, but if they were to say it publicly, people may take that as a license to kind of abuse when it doesn't really suit that person because they're not in that particular person's
Right.
circumstance. So they'll then adopt a more conservative approach, and that's something that I've kind of noticed, if that makes sense. So
Right.
but then I would expect, like I said, when you're dealing with adults, people should be able to understand what the person is saying, but that which is good, take it. That which I disagree with, I don't like, then kind of leave it. Not like everything they say, either I take it or totally disregard and cancel that person. So, but I think that's why, again, the work that you're doing, I think is very important, because where previously in the past, our scholars, many of them were polymaths, and they were well versed in this traditional Islamic sciences as well as like the psychology, heritology, what have you. Now it's quite separated. So we kind of need to collaborate and kind of work together, where if you've got an imam that, okay, they can lead the prayer, they can give general religious advice and spiritual advice and things like that. But when it comes to maybe marriage counseling, then maybe you go and put them in the direction of a counselor or someone who is a psychologist or someone who's a therapist, like this issue. So, but again, it's just trying to amplify these different.
Right. Yeah.
One of my pet peeves when people always say there aren't any Muslims helping it, and there are, but maybe you're not aware of them, kind of thing. So
I'm sorry. Can I put you on hold just for 1 second? I want to check the internet issue. Just give me 1 second. I'll be right back. Give me one second. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So while Usman is sorting out his internet issues, so for the benefit of people who recently joined or just want a bit of an overview who maybe joined a bit late, I'm speaking to Usman Mughni, who is a family and marriage therapist based in the United States of America. He is also the founder. He's got a private practice where he provides therapy and counseling services to Muslims, non-Muslims, families, individuals and couples on a range of matters to deal with trauma, intimacy issues, addiction problems, whether it's substance addiction, sex addiction, porn addiction. The main topic for today's Instagram live has been around sex addiction and porn addiction, and just hearing a little bit about Usman's his career, which he started, I think, in 2010. So he's got over 10 years of experience working with Muslim families as well. And again, he's also has had religious training as well. He previously worked as a Quran teacher and also worked as a therapist at a hospital. Are you ready now? Are you back?
Come back. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to fill in the gaps. Yeah, so just got a couple more questions before Maghrib, so I need to get up soon. But is there anything that you want to, before I ask my next questions, that you want to maybe talk about or any events that you've got upcoming?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm pretty new to Instagram, so I mean, please follow. I'm trying to. It's interesting. You pointed out the idea of nuances, and that we're adults and we should understand that there are nuances. I would hope so. I think people still struggle with that, Habeeb. So we're working on that. Like as a society, as individuals, understanding nuances. So my wife and my wife is a life coach, and her and I have teamed up and started a podcast. We're going to be posting that out, but I'm always trying to post out like content on Instagram that speaks about different issues, whether it's with mental health or relationships, from a nuanced perspective. So my hope is to start to get people to really deeply think about these issues from a like outside of just like kind of a black and white approach, right? And even with the idea of pornography, as we're talking about, we're starting to see that it's not a simple answer. Every situation is unique. It's multifaceted. There's it's not a if you watch pornography you're a horrible human being, and if you don't you're the best person in the world. It's not that simple.
So sorry, I might have missed it, Usman. Did you mention the name of the podcast with your wife?
So it's it's going to be up soon. I'll post the details on my Instagram page.
Okay, so if people want to find out more about the podcast, they should visit. Is it your Instagram
It's my
handle, or
Instagram.
your
It's my
website?
Instagram. Correct.
Okay,
Yes.
so yeah, so I think I've pinned Usman. So and again, obviously you can see his name. So you can, and I'll save this live. So again, for those of you who want to hear about Usman's upcoming podcast with his wife, please go and check out his Instagram handle. And again, if you want to book a service, do you offer services online, or is it only?
I do offer services online, and I will say, especially for somebody who is struggling with pornography addiction or sex addiction, or it doesn't even have to be related to that, even sometimes marriage issues in general, right? There is this concern of like, oh, am I sharing too much? I'm worried about my privacy and so on. So like we have, as therapists, we have very strict rules about confidentiality. So and I do want to give the listeners a reassurance that like outside of just the Islamic principle of not sharing when somebody shares and trusts you with the secret, we have very, very strict rules within our license to practice that make sure that things are completely kept confidential. So rest assured, if you do share something, that it's gonna be in a safe environment. It's gonna be a safe, non-judgmental environment. So for those listeners out there who are struggling or know somebody who's struggling, please don't let it reach a point where either you just get wrong advice from friends or you let it get out of control, and then if we're talking about relationships, we're talking about families breaking apart, and these have irreversible repercussions, if it's not handled in a professional manner.
And do you also offer? You mentioned marital counselling. Do you also offer premarital counselling and
Yes.
therapy? Does that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
100%. Yes. Uh, there is a decent amount of research now coming out that shows the benefits of premarital counseling in, increasing the health and stability of marriages in the future. So yes, I'm very, very passionate about premarital counseling. Yeah.
A couple more questions. What are your thoughts about people self-diagnosing themselves, especially again, speaking within the realm of like sex and porn addiction, as being a sex addict or porn addict? Do you think that's healthy? And again, if it's them self-diagnosing themselves, or maybe their partner self-diagnosing their partner, do you think that's something that is good, or is that problematic?
To be labeled as. Sure. I'm sorry. Are you talking about the label of being an addict? Sure.
No, I'm talking about the self-diagnosis. The only reason I'm saying that is because I've seen some
Oh
people
yeah.
use it
Right.
as an excuse for bad behavior, shall we say? So if I got caught doing some extracurricular activities, oh, sorry, I'm a sex addict. That's why.
Yeah.
You see that a lot with celebrities. So I'm just wondering, I just want to hear what your thoughts about without being diagnosed properly with a clinical professional, and what are your thoughts about people chucking around the label very loosely, like whether it's sex addict, porn addict, or like a narcissist? These are the type of labels that I see people quickly.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna bring that. Exactly. I was gonna bring that up. Like, please don't throw around clinical terms just like haphazardly. There are specific criteria, and it takes a professional to diagnose that. You give a great example with the word narcissist. It's so overused now. My partner's a narcissist. This person's a narcissist. That person. There is a world of difference between having narcissistic traits versus being, in the cluster of personality disorders, having narcissistic personality disorder. That's specific criteria, that only a professional will be able to evaluate and diagnose. And with regards to pornography addiction, same thing, right? Like, you don't get to determine that your partner has an addiction or not. That has to come from a professional. And for people who I haven't come across this. I haven't come across anybody saying that like I'm addicted and so therefore it's excusable. In fact, most people will argue that they're not addicted. They don't know it's not an addiction. I don't know. My partner keeps saying it's an addiction. My wife or my husband keeps saying it's an addiction. I don't believe it's an addiction. That's usually what I get. I don't usually see people saying that, well, it's an addiction, so too bad, it's not my fault. Because having an addiction doesn't. Yes, it's not as simple as like, oh, snap out of it, use your willpower, but it's also not that you are completely out of control and you have no control over the behavior, right? You have the power to reach out to a professional. You have the power to understand those patterns. You have the power to come up with a different game plan to tackle that. So it's not that like, okay, I have the label of being addicted to XYZ, and so therefore I'm off the hook, and like the pen has been lifted, right? And my deeds are not going to be recorded. That's not how it works.
So it's important, obviously, like you said, to go to professional. I think that's important. I'm glad you kind of said that, rather than like people self-diagnosing themselves. Final question, unless you've got one. Yeah, I wanted to ask this. Actually, I've got two questions. Sorry. First one is there any Muslim scholar in the past that maybe inspired you, or you was inspired by, to kind of do the work that you're doing?
Is there any Muslim scholar?
That's just like similar
Yes.
work, or maybe someone in your community. I'm just wondering out of interest.
Sure. No. Great question. I mean, as far as Al-Balkhi, I learned about him after I became a therapist, to be honest. So that was not necessarily inspiration. However, I used so Al-Balkhi, I would say, was the founder of what we now know to be cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's something that's heavily used. At least in the U.S., it's considered the gold standard in most hospital settings. So even in my private practice, I use cognitive behavioral therapy quite a bit, and there definitely is an overlap between and cognitive behavioral therapy, in a nutshell, being evaluating the lens which you view the world through, and trying to see it from a more balanced, realistic perspective, as opposed to black and white thinking, as opposed to assuming the worst, as opposed to minimizing and maximizing certain things. So in that, I see a very strong connection between our religious literature and cognitive behavioral therapy in particular. But I mean, as far as examples, the connection that our prophet made with his community, made with the companions, where he understood their pain points, and he spoke to them accordingly, and he really sallallahu alaihi wasallam, like, had his finger on the pulse of that society. That was definitely something inspiring for me, reading the biography of the prophet, and seeing how he was empathetic, and how he not only worked to help others, but that he would stand up at night and pray for them, right? And that's one thing, like, I think you and I, like, when we're working with people, like, in starting on a tangent, we have to ask ourselves, like, do we pray for them afterwards? And I actually make it a point when I work with anyone, as a couple, and somebody struggling with anything, that I try and look at it through a lens of, like, not that, I'm the clinician and they're the patient and I'm better than them, but more of a, this is somebody who has so many good qualities, and if only we can work through helping this, how much good they'll be able to give to the world. And approaching it through that lens and praying for them. This I feel that I got through reading about the character of the prophet. So Al-Basri, well, is very inspirational. I learned about him a little bit later.
That's a better answer than the question I put across, and that's something that I should have rephrased the question. I said, which person? Because, like you mentioned, because even the scholars that we speak about, they were all inspired by the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Like you said, it's learning about his life, and for me as well, the empathetic nature. And yes, we know the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a servant of Allah, as a religious person, but also someone who was a leader that was helping and cared for the community. I think, again, that side of the Prophet, peace upon him, is not really sort of spoken about as much. So I'm glad that you kind of said that, rather than actually mentioning the scholar. So, yeah, very impressed with that answer. MashaAllah. Last question. So where do you see your practice and the work you're doing in the next 5 to 10 years, inshallah? Where do you see? What would you like, if you could share that with us?
That's a great question. I mean, when I first moved to Dallas in 2014. At that time, there were not as many Muslim therapists. Now this has really become a center for Muslim mental well-being and Muslim health, and it's only starting to expand. there are a lot of people talking about different projects. There are, more and more projects aimed towards really making a strong connection between our spiritual, our spiritual history and excuse me, our Islamic tradition and modern psychology. But me personally, I am, more and more passionate about premarital counseling, and my hope is to focus more on preventative medicine than curing certain ailments, right? Like on average, when it comes to couples therapy, people come to therapy 5 to 7 years after a problem has become prevalent. So whether it's pornography addiction or something else, or whether it's just communication issues or in-law issues, whatever it might be, my hope is, and I'm in the process of it, working on a very strong research-based premarital program so that we can really educate the community. The person who you choose to marry really impacts the trajectory of your life. You know, uh, so we want people who are looking to find their significant other to be informed and to know what to ask for and to know how to navigate through that in the healthiest manner, because healthy couples create healthy families create a healthy and strong society. So that's my larger goal, I hope.
Barakallah fiqh. Now, honestly, thank you. Sorry, it's just because I'm conscious of time and it's Maghrib over here, so I need to head off to pray. But thank you.
Okay, absolutely, yeah. Peaceful YOU. Yeah, peacefulyou.org. Peacefulyou.org. Yes. Yeah, correct. Yes. Well, yeah, welcome, Habiban. Absolutely. Okay, and let's make sure another 16 years don't pass. Yeah. Walaikum salam.